how do we set the minimum wage appropriately? And this relates to the third fear of, if it's set too low, it could have detrimental impacts on well-being. So, Julie, what do we know about how much the minimum wage currently impacts on the well-being of people on very low incomes in Aotearoa, New Zealand?
So what the minimum wage does is it provides a kind of like a floor. It provides sort of protection for people who are vulnerable, who may not be able to advocate very strongly in the labour market themselves. And so it gives this kind of robust, like, baseline level of wages. So for people who are not in a position to advocate strongly, it has that value. But I think we want to be quite careful in terms of thinking. I mean, it's important that we prevent exploitation for people who are vulnerable, but we don't want to be thinking that the minimum wage can do more than it is capable of doing. So you don't get annoyed at a hammer because it can't cut a straight line. You go get a pair of scissors, right? So, I mean, minimum wages, they will not necessarily help with things like income inequality. They won't necessarily raise income for families. There are other tools that might be much more effective at doing that. Things like working for families. They won't help, really, they won't help with the current situation in the housing market, which needs to be addressed in terms of the root causes of housing supply needing to be fixed. So when we think of minimum wages as providing a floor to prevent exploitation, that's a very solid way that they can improve the well-being of people who are on low incomes, but we shouldn't be expecting them to solve other problems that they're not really designed to fix.
And I think it's very important to remember that life on the minimum wage is really tough, and even a family with multiple members working at the minimum wage is still going to be doing it very tough, particularly in, as Julie says, with the housing market in Auckland. So it's not a cure for lots of those problems, and that's one of the issues in terms of the not too high, not too low range. You want to make sure that it is providing that floor, that it's stopping exploitation, and it's providing a minimum ability for people to buy the bare necessities. But it is bare necessities territory, and I don't think we should ever think that by increasing the minimum wage we can really address income distribution or child poverty. That's not what it's good at.
And suggest, as you say, Julie, that there are a number of other policy areas that we need to be thinking about in tandem, and I'm sure we'll get into some of those as we get into our Q&A. So I suppose finally, you mentioned there, Peter, the range, that not too low, not too high, just right, Goldilocks range. You give that in the paper at 18, somewhere between $18 to $25. Maybe just tell us a little bit about the thinking that led to the selection of that particular range. And given that we know that the living wage is currently set at $22.75, I suppose a very pertinent policy question is, could we safely and appropriately fix the minimum wage at that living wage of $22.75 and wherever it happens to move to in the future?
I might start off. We used a very sophisticated econometric tool called eyeballing to determine that range, and we freely admit in the paper that it's not a scientific study, and we looked at things like the unemployment benefit, working families, the state of the job market, and we came to that view that range of about $18 to $25 seems to be, if you like, the safe range within which a government, with the current amount of information they've got, could work. But the concerns we've got is that the setting of the minimum wage, it's based on work that MBIC does, which is pretty mainstream, but I would think a bit narrow. Their model, for example, will always say that if you put up the minimum wage, employment will fall. I mean, it's just axiomatic. That's how the equations are written. They don't have that David Card demand side thing that Julie talked about in them. So we would certainly hope that in time, and perhaps quickly, the government could start thinking about some more empirical work on the real effects of the minimum wage in America, sorry, in New Zealand, because a lot of the studies do come from America, and you've got to be very careful that that's a very, very, very different labour market to what we've got here. It's a different economy. So I think
just really nicely answered, Peter, the first audience question I was going to put to you, which was exactly this. So talking about concerns being raised about MB's current modelling and the criteria that they're using there. And that apparently produced an estimate that it could lead to the loss of this year's rise could lead to the loss of 6,400 jobs. So you've basically said there you've got some issues with that modelling, and you'd like other factors to be included. Is that essentially the problem, that it's largely based on overseas models that don't really apply here in New Zealand? What are the other issues potentially with the model that they're using?
I think that's the main one. I mean, to be fair to our friends in MB, this is hard stuff, and it's very hard to model. But perhaps one of the other things that the department could be looking at is just a wider range of studies looking at various things, and just giving ministers and members of the public just a fuller picture of what happened, what the minimum wage does. And one thing in particular, it might sound trivial, but there's not really a consensus in New Zealand about what is the minimum wage for. It does lots of things, and different people think it's to relieve poverty, or it's to stop exploitation, it's to encourage people into the employment. So I think just some better thinking about what it's for, and certainly in our view, it should be used for a narrow range of things rather than being the universal cure for everything. So having that in the mix would be important.